couple of things to remind you of when it comes to the problem of evil. You know, I've tried to keep these things separate. Every time somebody suffers, they think it's evil, and that's just not true. You think about a person that commits a crime, they go to jail. No doubt they're suffering in jail, but we wouldn't say that their being in jail is necessarily evil. In fact, a lack of justice, we would say, isn't evil. It's not the way that the world ought to be. So we tried to pull these things apart, that evil and suffering are not identical, but they are certainly related. And what I want to point out tonight is, as we get into this question, is why does God allow so much evil or so much suffering in the world? I think there's a theological response that we need to keep in mind. You know, I was talking with, this goes back when I was in North Carolina, and had made some friends. There was a group that met in Raleigh, and they were talking about this, and I had the opportunity to go over and to visit with them. And I was kind of the token Christian in the room. I was it. But made a lot of friends as a result, and invited them to some of the classes that I was teaching at the seminary on the problem of evil. What was interesting, because they said, why do you think that, if God exists, why do you think that God allows so much suffering? And I say, I think it's an important question. Again, we need to pull apart what it is that we're really dealing with. Is it primarily emotional? Is it primarily intellectual? That's important for you on how you address this problem. But I think if you just look at Scripture, we need to set our expectations the way that Jesus said to set our expectations. And when he says in this world you're going to have suffering, guess what? You're going to have suffering. We shouldn't wake up in the morning and think, have this kind of Pollyanna view of our experience. It's just not the way that it's going. It's not the way that it's going to be. And I think part of this is the amount of evil that we see in the world, just the sheer amount of it, which is enormous. And the kinds of evil. There's not like one kind, but just the kinds of evil in the world. It will extend as far as our depravity goes. At some point, we have to get to a theological point and say, how far does depravity go? Well, that's how far this is going to go. Well, how far does it go? I'll tell you, I'm not sure. I'm not sure the full extent of what depravity looks like. But here's the thing. If I can sit in a room with atheists and they can agree with me that by looking around the world, and they agree with me that the world is not the way that it ought to be, then we at least have a common starting point to work our way out. It's just that when we talk about the world is not the way that it ought to be, what word do we use to describe that? At least in Christianity, we use the word sin. Sin is real and it's a factor. So pertaining to at least what I want to talk tonight about is at least the problem of natural evil. When you think of hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes, and there's going to be some other things, I want to point something out. The world was created good. If you go back into Genesis, that's the word that's actually used. It doesn't say the world was created perfect. It says that the world was created good, tov. It's good. And I'm not convinced at all. Some people say, well, if God created, then he had to have created the best possible world. And I'm not necessarily sold on that. Instead, I actually agree with Norm Geisler that what God does is he creates the best way to the best possible world. But what he also does, and this is what you see at the beginning of Genesis, is after he creates, what he does is he hands dominion over to us. The stewardship and the care of his creation is now our responsibility. So what this means is that physical evil is sometimes the result of, either directly or indirectly, the laws that govern the physical universe, as well as the decisions that we make in this universe. It's the laws of the universe, which God created with a regularity, and we, by the way, benefit from that every day. There's a predictability to our experience. It's not like you're going to walk out of here, I don't think. It's not like you're going to walk out of here and you're going to say you have a ball in your hand and you say, you know what? I'm not exactly sure how gravity is going to be behaving. And so I'm just going to kind of drop this ball and it might fly off on its own. It's probably not. And here's the thing. God is the one that has created that law-like regularity. We like its benefits. We typically don't like its deficits. That's where we find ourselves. So physical evil is sometimes the result of, either directly or indirectly, those laws plus the free decisions that we make. So God created the world such that natural laws work for the benefit of humanity. Now, think broad net humanity. But that may not mean that it's benefiting a specific person or a specific subgroup of people necessarily. For example, if a person and a moving car meet at an intersection, right? what's going to happen? I'm assuming no swerving here, right? What happens when the person meets that moving car? I think you know the answer. There's going to be physical pain, right? The person is probably going to lose in that interaction. This is how physical forces just work. And so when we think of natural evil, natural evil can occur from processes that frankly keep nature in balance. They're important. Some people have written on this. Paul Copan has written on this. Alistair McGrath has written on this. Michael Murray has written on this. And when you think about it, I just want to give you some examples of some things that are not even contested when you look at the way that the world is created and the fact that it's held in a fine balance. Here's some things to think about. How about the oxygen that you breathe? How about that? Oxygen comprises 21% of the atmosphere. If it were 25%, fires would be erupting everywhere. But if it were as low as 15%, we would be suffocating. So there's a balance to creation itself. Or how about this? If the gravitational force were altered by 1 part in 10 to the 40, so that's 10 followed by 40 zeros, the sun would not exist, and the moon would crash into the earth, or it would just fly sheer off into outer space. And even a slight increase in the force of gravity would result in all of the stars being much more massive than our sun, with the effect that the sun would burn too rapidly and erratically to sustain life. How about this? If the universe were expanding at a rate of 1/1,000,000th more slowly than it is, the temperature on Earth would be 10,000 degrees Celsius. By the way, you wouldn't be here, just gonna say, right? The average distance between stars in our galaxy of 100 billion stars, I know that because I counted them the other night. 100 billion stars is 30 trillion miles. Now, if that distance between these orbits were slightly different, the orbits themselves would become erratic, and there would be extreme temperature variations on Earth. By the way, that would mean we're not here. So let me give you some perspective on this. Traveling at space shuttle speed, which is 17,000 miles an hour or 5 miles a second, it would take 201,450 years to travel 30 trillion miles. But that's the average distance between these planets, and they are in places that keep things in a balance. If Jupiter, let's go to one of our favorite planets. If Jupiter was not in its current orbit, we would be bombarded with space material. Think space junk. Jupiter's gravitational field acts like a cosmic vacuum cleaner, so to speak. It attracts asteroids and comets that would otherwise strike the Earth. Here's another thing. If the thickness of the Earth's crust was greater, too much oxygen would be transferred to the crust to support life. If it were thinner, volcanic activity and tectonic activity would make life on Earth impossible. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're like, why are you doing this? Hold on, I'm going to get to it here in a second. Let me give you just a couple more things to think about here. Are y'all taking notes, by the way? All right, good. How about this? The rotation of the Earth. If the rotation of the Earth took longer than 24 hours, temperature differences would be too great between night and day. If the rotation period was shorter, atmospheric wind velocities would be too great for us. Seems to be balanced. Surface temperature differences would be too great if the tilt of the Earth were altered just a very little bit. How about this? If the atmospheric discharge, like, what is that? That's lightning, all right? That's all it is. If the lightning rate were greater, there would be too much fire destruction on the Earth. But if it were less, there would be too little nitrogen that actually fixes into the soil. By the way, if you're a farmer, you appreciate nitrogen being in the soil. It's how we grow stuff. Let me give you just one more. If there were more seismic activity, so if you think, and I was thinking back some years ago, the plates were shifting, and what happens often is it pulls the water back out from just the sheer force of tectonic shifting. It can pull water literally completely out with such a force. It's like 4 nuclear bombs going off underneath the crust of the earth. And what happens is it sucks the water out. People were talking about standing on the beach. If you remember, I'm trying to remember what year this was. People were standing on the beach, and literally it was like the water was sucked out so far, it was like it got dry under their feet like this. The problem is once it settled back under, the water came over the people and killed about 250,000 people. Now, here's the thing. When you think of something like seismic activity and the shifting of plates, if there were less of that, nutrients on the ocean floor and in river runoff would not be cycled back to the continents, and we need it to be. Now, I'm bringing all this up to basically make a very simple point. There is a balance in creation itself, and what we typically like are the benefits of that balance, but we typically don't like the deficits that go with that balance. Even earthquakes, by the way, has been pointed out, are necessary to sustain life as we know it. Now, let me get back to free choice here, because that all sounds good and fine, but how connected are we to what happens in the world, meaning the free choices that we make? And the answer is, we're quite connected. Our bad choices do not affect us alone. Let me give you an example. If two adults decide to have an affair and one is married with children, it affects the entire family. Frank Turek said there's a solidarity of humanity. The choices that we make impact more than just us. And other examples to this point include sexually transmitted diseases, drug and alcohol use. That typically affects other people. You get the idea. But even if you think of what's going on in the world, everything in the physical universe is being described, it's in an increasing state of deterioration, which includes physical organisms, which, by the way, that would include me. I'm in a state of deterioration. Time increases, and so does deterioration. Some theologians think that this is a matter of the fall. When you go back into Genesis chapter 3, and what happened with the fall of humanity, it affected not just us, it affected creation itself. And so what's described, N.T. Wright says, when you look at Jesus, what he does at the cross is he's not just fixing broken souls, he's fixing a broken universe. And he's going to ultimately put it back to rights. This is kind of the language you get in Jeremiah chapter 23 when you go, hey, where is heaven? And the answer is you're standing on it, just not yet. Not yet. He's going to put it back together. But if you think about this idea, and I like the example that Norm Geisler gives, when you think about deterioration, this could even affect genetics. Adam and Eve, it could be pointed out, were genetically pure. The result, though, of the fall is deterioration. So here's an example. Think of copies. Let's say you take a page that you're reading and you copy it from the original. And then you take the copy and you copy that. And then you take that copy and you copy that. You get the idea? I'm only going to do that a few times because I think it helps make the point. After a while, you see how deteriorated the copy is from the original. When you apply this to genetics, and this was Geisler's point, from the first humans, many copying distortions and errors are made. Couple that with the deteriorated ecosystem, and you find genetic difficulties that result in a lot of physical afflictions. So other examples, by the way, and then I was talking about free will, and you go, how does free will impact all of this? Think about this. Isn't it interesting to watch people discuss the choices that humans make and the impact that that's happening on the climate? Now, here's what I'm not here to discuss. I'm not here to discuss whether or not climate change is real. I'm trying to make a simple point, that people are getting to the place where what they'll see is that there is a connection. There is a connection between the choices that we make and what results in the world. Theologically, we kind of already knew that, right? But you can give other examples as well. Back in Vietnam, when the use of Agent Orange was happening, it affected people. It affected creation, but it affected people. How about inbreeding? Inbreeding is a choice that people make, just like the use of Agent Orange, but inbreeding has an effect on people. You get the idea? I'm trying to use a couple of examples so that you can see the connection here, that what's happening inside of us that's not exactly completely disconnected from the choices that we're making. So when you think of natural disasters, some natural disasters occur, by the way, as a matter of another free choice. And the answer is it's God's choice. God's choice. Divine judgment is not evil. It's judgment. And when you look at the narrative of Scripture, there are times, and I even talked about this morning, for those of you that were at church, I talked about this morning, when you have an army of 900 chariots, and what God does is he brings a rain that basically stifles the 900 chariots. It was his act. It was an act of judgment on those people that he brought about, divine judgment. So when you think of other examples, if nothing else, you can think of the 10 plagues. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. God orders Aaron to touch the Nile River with his staff, and the waters were turned to blood. What was the result? The fish in the river died, but moreover, the Egyptians couldn't drink the water. There's an act of God, and then there's a physical result. Let me just give you one more. God rained hail, fire, and thunder upon Egypt, and hail struck down all the crops in the fields and shattered every tree. Hailstorms were unusual, by the way, in that area. It's a pretty arid region, like when you think of Egypt. But what this got their attention. They were extremely frightened. Moses, when you think about it, Moses pleads with God to stop the storm. Make this stop. His judgment, by the way, had that kind of an impact. I bring all of this up to show you the connection between what's happening in nature. Sometimes biblically what you see is that this is an act of divine judgment. Other things that we see, sometimes this is the natural outworking of decisions that we have made ourselves and the consequences that result therefrom. But when you look at the world itself, let me tell you what nobody's really wondering. Nobody's really wondering whether or not the universe was created with a fine balance. Nobody's really wondering that. It is. You can't actually manipulate the dials of the universe very much and still have the life in it, life like us. So to go back to the final point that I want to make, and then we'll get to your questions. I'll invite Melody to join me up on the stage and just turn to you. What I'm not trying to be here is insensitive. That's not it. In fact, over 20-something years of being in ministry, one of the things that I devote most of my time to is people suffering, people hurting for any number of reasons. I don't consider that to be something that I'm doing that's acting against the will of God. When you say, well, you know what, you probably deserve it. That's not exactly how it works. Instead, what you do is you work with people to see how God can bring beauty from ashes. How can God bring beauty from ashes? The problem of evil and the problem of suffering, friends, is not particularly a Christian problem. It's just a problem. And every single worldview, whether it's Christian or not, has to explain it. When C.S. Lewis was giving some thought to this, and he gave a lot of thought to this because he watched his wife suffer and die. And as a result, he ended up writing some things, reflections on pain and suffering. But one of the things that he said was this, because there was a time where he was an atheist, and he was giving a reflection on that time as an atheist, and he said, the thing is everybody has to explain the problem of evil. He said, but then you have the other question. It's the problem of goodness itself. And if my atheism, he said, were true, then I had this lingering question, where did goodness come from at all? And atheism, as he gave thought to, said it was completely incapable of providing that story. He says, so the atheist actually has two problems, not just the problem of evil, because they've got to explain it too, but the atheist has to also explain the problem of good. He said, what I found as I came to Jesus and I came to Christianity was that story was already answered. It's grounded in the nature and the goodness of God himself. And then you find the solution to the problem of evil is in Jesus and the cross. And you defeat suffering and evil by suffering itself, but addressing the ultimate end of suffering, which is death, and overcoming it. That's the story of the resurrection. But I want to give the rest of the night to your questions. I'm sure that you have some, so for those of you that are drinking your coffee, you can drink your coffee. And I'm going to let Melody answer questions tonight. Does that sound good to you? All right. So Melody, I'm going to invite you up here because sorry. While she sits there, she goes, I want you to ask all of your hard questions to Jerry.
Speaking of evil.
Yeah. That's not evil. That would just be suffering. See?
Suffering
Told
for
you they're
me
not.
or suffering for
No,
them?
that would be suffering for you.
Oh, okay.
But we do want to address your questions. What you got out there? Do we have any in?
Oh, just a few. I love it how you guys all submit your questions at the same time.
Right.
So then I don't get a chance to read them until right now. Okay, hold on. All right, question number 1. You ready?
I think so.
Is suffering ever wasted, such as an unbelieving juvenile is savagely brutalized by a gang and then dies? Is that wasted?
Is it ever wasted? No. Look, when you think about some of the assumptions that are in the question itself, right? Even if you think of free will, one of the greatest goods that we have is that we're endowed with that capacity. And just like I was talking about before, when you think about the balance of the cosmos, and it's like fire. We like fire. We like to cook with it. We like the fact that it can heat our homes. But when you think about you stick your hand in it, we typically don't like fire right then. Somebody gets hurt from it, we typically don't like fire right then. And understandably so. I mean, we get that that's a difficult, that's a difficult experience. But then you think about something like free will, which, by the way, when you think of the brutalization of someone, nobody is here to endorse that or to condone that. But when you think about we're endowed with certain capacities ultimately to choose the good, right? But it's a double-edged sword. That's what you see in the fall and, well, for that matter, through the rest of the narrative of Scripture. So is it wasted? No, not in the sense that a person has a capacity that is a good to possess. That's one of the ways that we're uniquely created. And so when you think about one of the assumptions in the question, it would be like, one of the ways to eradicate the problem is to eradicate the capacity of freedom. But then what you've done is you've removed one of the greatest goods that God has provided in creation itself, which is the provision of that capacity, and by giving it to us, our ability to know Him and to love Him or to choose Him. That's the other side of the coin. So do I see that it's wasted? I don't see that it's wasted. Do I see that it's necessary? I don't see that it's that either, because you know what? Whoever brutalized could have chosen something different. They could have chosen something different. I do want to say this, though. Sometimes people will go to Romans, and in quoting Romans, you go into Romans 8, and that, God has a good. One of the things that we need to keep in mind is that when Paul is talking about that, he's talking to the church. He's not necessarily talking to just everybody. He's talking to the church. But I still think that's a little bit different than what the question is getting at.
Have you seen the new Avengers movie yet?
I have not. All right.
So the question is,
did Brandon Lupke ask this question?
Is all this universe being balanced chalk sounds a whole lot like Thanos. Is that where you got this content?
No, I actually got it from science. I mean, come on. No, look, the things that I brought up, and by the way, no, I've been busy. And so I'm going to go see Endgame, and so if somebody spoils it for me tonight, you will suffer. All right? It won't be evil. It won't be evil because you asked for it. All right? No, seriously, I do want to go see Endgame, so no spoilers on that. No, I didn't get it from Thanos, right? I did not. The things that I was pointing out are the uncontested things that science has discovered. Nobody, whether atheist, agnostic, Christian, whatever, everybody is agreeing to that point. And it's usually called the anthropic principle. Frank Tipler and John Barrow, and I got to know Frank Tipler when I was teaching in New Orleans. They wrote a book, if I remember, I was back in 1986, called The Cosmic Anthropic Principle. These are two physicists teaching at Tulane University, and they're the ones that really got this thing going to say, when you do physics, it's amazing. It's amazing when you look at the universe and how balanced the universe is to provide any possibility of life itself. And the whole reason that I was bringing that up was to say, when God created this, He created it for life. However, there's a brokenness to creation itself. And that's why I tried to tie the rest of the story in. But no, I didn't get it from Thanos.
I just asked the question because it was a fun question. You didn't have
to
It is
a fun question.
Have to answer it,
no, I had to, because they asked it. I took it seriously. Can I ask a question?
Movie.
How many of you have seen the Avengers movie? All right. Very good. Now I know who to avoid when we're done.
Okay, back to serious questions here. Okay, this is a really good question. Are you saying that the God of the Bible's glory is more important than the livelihood and happiness of humans?
Yeah, I don't think that primarily God created us for our own happiness. I don't have that. I don't have one biblical reason to think that at all. He created us for holiness, not happiness, especially with the way that we define happiness. Our definition of happiness typically deviates from his definition of happiness. Even if you go back to Aristotle had this idea of what's called eudaimonia. And the idea behind that word is that there's human flourishing, and there are conditions under which humans flourish. I totally agree with Aristotle. When you think of what Aristotle was getting at here, he says man was created with a telos, a teleology, an end or a goal, right? Now, this is coming from a pagan philosopher, but I think he's on it. There's an end or a goal, and the choices that we make will either gear us toward that end or take us from that end. Taking us from it shows that basically it more or less connects us to vices, and then what happens as a result of vices, we don't flourish. But I'm not committed to the idea at all. They say, what is the chief end of man? The chief end of man is for him to just be happy, not the way we define it. The chief end of man is to know God and to enjoy him. And if you remember when we started this discussion on the problem of evil, one of the things that I quoted was C.S. Lewis in his Problem of Pain. And he said, God basically really arrests our attention through our suffering. Have you noticed in the narrative of Scripture that when things are going really well, we tend to forget God? Have you noticed that yet? We tend to forget him. We get on cruise control. And then what happens is God does something that arrests our attention, which, by the way, is well within God's prerogative to do it when he's the one that set the goal for us to begin with. It's not something that we set for ourselves. So, yeah, do I think that the primary thing is the glory of God? Yes. But if you look at the rest of the Scriptures, I mean, the whole thing is, what is the purpose of the cross? Is that God so loved us that he sent his Son. So the idea that there's this, that God is doing everything for his glory, and what he has is nothing about us in mind. I'm sitting there going, no, I look at the cross. He's got a lot of us in mind. A lot of us is in mind. So I don't see those things necessarily at odds. It's that we have to redefine the categories and put them back under the cross. And then I think we're back on track.
So if God has created all things, then how can we say that he is not the ultimate creator of evil?
Yeah, because evil's not a thing. That's why. When you look in Genesis, Genesis, God creates everything and he says it's good. You remember how I started the discussion tonight? He looks at everything and it's good. It's not broken. But I agree with St. Augustine. St. Augustine said that evil is a privation of goodness. So it's like rust on a car, right? It's a parasite on things that already exist. It's not a thing in itself. So when you look at evil that way, then no, God didn't create evil. He created things. And then what you have is like rust on metal. Or if you think about how we, so to speak, have deteriorated, like I was talking about earlier, how there's been deterioration in us. That wasn't how God created us. It's just how we are now. So no, I'm not committed to the idea that God created evil. What he did do, though, is he created us with certain capacities to bring about things that are evil. And I think there's a difference there. The capacity itself isn't evil. Creating us with a free will is not evil, especially when that capacity is what enables us to experience love or just choosing God. That's not evil. But again, there's the double-edged part of it, right? So we always have to keep the other part in mind.
Okay, so Hitler's back.
Oh, man.
You ready?
He always shows up.
Hitler,
Yeah.
he always shows
Hitler
up.
and those Canaanites,
So this person asks, my husband's family says that they do not believe in a God who would allow their family to suffer and die under Hitler. So how would you respond to a situation like that when this is so personal to them?
Yeah, here's the thing. I don't think that's even primarily an intellectual question at all. I'm not trying to be mean. I'm trying to be honest. That's primarily an emotional issue. And you handle the emotional, and scholars even make these distinctions. When I was writing my book on the problem of evil, you pull these things apart. You also respond to them differently. So if the primary issue is emotional, then what the person needs, honestly, is pastoral care and counseling. For those people that have put themselves under good counseling, I'm telling you, there are stories out there on what an enormous positive impact it's had on their life. Because here's why. Sometimes people emotionally don't know how to process the experiences that they're going through. When you think of the death of the unexpected death of a spouse, I had a friend die this week, 43 years old. Somebody that I spent a lot of time on a golf course with when I was on the golf team going back into high school. And just because of life, we were separated by distance. But, one of the benefits of social media, we were always able to stay together. He would send me these little quips. Hey, you were a little wordy in your sermon this morning, and I'm like, dude, come on. You thank God for friends like that, right? But if you look at the day before, there was no expectation of him dying. None. The next day, he's gone. And then I start to see the people reacting to it. They don't know how to process it because it was such an unexpected loss. In that moment, here's what you don't need. What you don't need is an intellectual answer because it isn't an intellectual problem. What you need is someone to walk alongside you. You need someone to encourage you. You need someone to help you. And even someone in the right way to kind of coach you on the kinds of feelings and stuff that comes with this. This is why as one of the things that we do when someone loses a loved one, whether it's a spouse or a parent or even a child, one of the things that we try to do is provide some books because it slows you down, by the way, as you read through it. And it helps you, the things that people normally experience emotionally, and it can kind of come in cycles, so that they can anticipate what it is that they're going to experience, and they can handle it well. Here's what I've seen. A lot of people don't know how to handle it well. We can respond a number of ways to suffering. You can respond in bitterness, or you can respond in faith. Those are basically your two choices, though. You can become bitter and entangled in it. I'm not saying that the hurt isn't real, but being hurt doesn't mean you're bitter. But you can respond in bitterness, or you can respond in faith. People bring up World War II and the atrocities in World War II, but here's the thing. How many people were also basically entrenched more in their faith in the midst of suffering? Those are the other stories that need to be told, rather than just looking at some of the others, like an Eliezer Wiesel, who wrote the Night Trilogy. And I was blessed to listen to him speak up at TCU when I was a seminary student. And he could not understand the kinds of evil that he was experiencing, and the fact that he was seeing his father die in a death camp and so forth. And he says, I just can't fathom that God would do this. And as a result, he walks away. But think of all the others that said, I can't fathom that this evil will be left unaddressed, and God will ultimately bring it to judgment. There's the other side of the story. And you see these other people coming to God, knowing that his plan is to put this all back together. There is always the other story. So which is it? Is it an intellectual issue? Is it an emotional issue? And then you have to handle it. Well, you have to be honest about it, and then you have to handle it appropriately.
So this question is kind of a follow-up question to the one you answered just before that one. So how is it fair that God places his glory over our current circumstances?
How is it fair that God places his glory?
When you say that, ultimately he wants our holiness, not our happiness, when you say that ultimately we're meant to enjoy God, but how is it fair that he doesn't consider, our benefit and our good over his glory?
Well, there are a couple of assumptions there that he's not considering your benefit and your good. If you remember the way that we started this, there's so many layers to this conversation, right? But when you think, how is this fair? How much more fair can God be than to create the world, to create it in an unbroken state, to set it with the parameters whereby creation itself can flourish, right? And then there you are. How much more fair can he be? Instead of, I think there's a little bit of blame shift in the question is basically what I'm trying to say. Because when you look, I'm not trying to be insensitive, but if you think of some of the examples that I was giving here, and I wasn't trying to be cute with some of the things, when you think of even inbreeding, this is a choice that people make, and the impact is usually on the kid. Or when you think of an Adolf Hitler, he had choices that he made. How many people could have stood up and said this isn't going to happen, but they didn't? That's why I started tonight the way that I did. How far does the problem of evil go? And my answer is, how far does depravity go? You get an answer to that question, you get an answer to how far it can go. Apparently, it's really far. Apparently, it's really, really far. The other assumption that's being made in the question is that the end, when you think of even some of the balance of nature that I was talking about here, a lot of times when we look at, there's this balance that happens in nature to the world itself, which at sometimes we're not in the place where we're benefiting from it. When you think of an earthquake, or you think of a tsunami, and you think of the plates shifting, there was a reason that I was getting into all of that. The world needs it. However, if we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, so there's the balance of the good for the world itself, but I might not personally be benefiting from that good in this moment or in this time. Lightning. We can't have much less. We certainly can't have much more. That's why I was giving the example. You get struck by lightning, probably not going to feel good, right? So we're making this judgment. We're making this judgment that as God is governing his creation, he's doing a pretty poor job when there's suffering that's happening in a part of the world. All I'm suggesting is maybe we're not in the best place to make that judgment. One of the examples that I've given here before, and I hope it helps to finish the answer to the question, is this. If you think of everything that God is holding in balance here, the way that Colossians 1:15 through 17 says is the cosmos is actually being held and sustained in the hands of Jesus. The whole show. But I get on one thing. Let me give you one thing. When you think of economics, I've used this example before. One thing. And I want the best economists in the world to give me the guarantee on what the economy is going to look like in 3 years. And guess what they're going to say? We can't do that. We can't do that. And you go, well, why can't you do that? You're the best. And the answer is there are too many variables. There are just too many. So if you think of one of the assumptions that's being made in the question is that, you know what, I've got my head wrapped around on how the cosmos works. We can't figure out economics really for a prolonged period of time, but I know how the universe works. And I can make some suggestions on how God ought to run it. I want to throw this out there. Maybe a little bit of intellectual humility is a good thing. A good thing. I am personally committed to this, that God isn't wasteful with anything. I'm personally committed to that. But even if I look at suffering in my own life, I'm going to be totally honest with you. There have been a few times where I thought, you know what? It's probably somebody else's turn. I'm just being honest with you. From the suffering that I was enduring as a kid to other things that after a while it just felt like it was getting piled on. I've said this to God, and I think he was okay with me saying it because I said it in frustration. It is probably somebody else's turn because I've had enough. Have you ever felt that way before? Here's the thing. That was a totally emotional reaction to my suffering. And do you know what I really needed? I needed encouragement. I needed friends. And I needed to see that God can do something good through it. That's what I needed. When I was in the throes of suffering, that usually wasn't the time that I was going to see it the best, to be honest with you. Which is why, as a rule of thumb, personally, I'm just throwing this out here, I don't make life decisions when I'm in the throes of suffering. I just don't. Or when I'm in the throes of anger. You know what? This is what I'm going to do. Probably because I'm not in the best emotional state to evaluate things and to make wise decisions. It's absolutely no different when a person is in the throes, in the time of Hitler, or you just pick it. We're usually not in the best emotional state to really evaluate, to assess, and to know what is the best decision. We usually have to get beyond the emotions so that we can then see a little bit more clearly, and we can assess and find a way forward. That was one of the best things that I learned at times where, just to be honest with you, and I've talked to my parents about this in the recent past, you know, when I'm sitting there as a 10-year-old kid, I'm sitting there in the hospital, and I'm going, I'm not waking up in the morning. And I was convinced of it. I'm not waking up in the morning. And to see my mom sitting over to my left, you know, but here was the thing. It was all right. I mean, it was all right. It was all right. Here's why, is because there are worse things for me than death. They're just worse things. Because I've got one that's getting me beyond it. That's why I started with the theological points that I started with tonight.
You ready for the next one?
I think so.
Okay, this is a little bit of a topic change here. How are we to understand the dialogue between God and Satan in Job chapter 1? Is that literal? And if so, do they continue to have that kind of dialogue?
I can't answer the second of those. I don't have any reason to think not. Do I think that it was a literal dialogue? It certainly represents itself as a literal dialogue. I don't think it's figurative in any sense, which, by the way, is somewhat teaching to us. Because the answer in the book of Job was already given to you at the beginning of the book of Job, right? Some people look to the end of the book of Job and you go, oh man, this guy gets more wealth, he gets more land, he gets all. Be careful with that, because some people don't. That is not the story of the book of Job. Ooh, if I just hang in there long enough, I'm going to get double the land, double the crops, double the cows, double the whatever. Don't do that, right? That is not the meaning of the book of Job. At the beginning of it, when you have the adversary, which is the way that is often is best, I think, translated, the adversary requests permission to go before God. And when God says, have you considered my servant Job? Have you noticed even at the beginning of the book of Job, what does he say to the adversary? You're not going to win this. There's going to be great suffering, but you're not going to win this. Now, Job, to be fair, Job gets distracted. Which, by the way, God totally understands, because he suffers tremendously. But did you notice God's answer to this? In all of this, Job, what have you needed? What you've needed is me. That's what you've needed. And in all of this time, guess what? I've been here with you. So, no, I see the beginning of the book of Job as that is an actual conversation between the adversary and God. He gets permission, by the way, with restrictions. Every time there are restrictions. And what that also means is, and there's another, I think, important theological point to Job, and it's this. For whatever it is that you are suffering, it is finite in intensity and it is finite in duration. At least on this side of the ledger. Whatever it is finite in intensity and it is finite in duration. So when you're in the throes of something, have you ever heard there is a friend of mine that I consider kind of a second father in my hometown. And I got to see him when I went to see my dad, who was having surgery not too long ago. And I remember talking with him as we were sitting in the hospital. And I told him, I said, I remember some years ago, some things that you said, because I was having a pretty difficult time. And he just kind of put his hand on, he has a real deep voice. And he just put his hand on me and he said, this will pass. This will pass. Well, it passed. It passed. Finite in intensity and finite in duration. That being said, I'm just going to be honest with you. I have some medical conditions that are only going to be fixed when I get a resurrection body. And I already know that. I have already accepted that. And that's another part of the problem of evil and the problem of suffering that we have to get around to, is that there's some things to our experience that instead of saying, I just want the affliction removed, but which, by the way, Paul said that, if you remember, 3 times I prayed that the thorn in the flesh would be removed. It's a physical affliction of some sort. It's not sin. It's a physical affliction of some sort. And 3 times God said, that's not going to happen. Because people are going to see my strength in you, my grace. It's hard to get this in the Greek, Melody, because, it's like my grace is sufficient, and it's not even what it is saying. It's a verb, and it's present. My grace in this moment, sufficing for you. Sufficing for you. Sufficing for you. Paul is sitting there, by the way, giving a pretty good cloak, because he goes, this is hindering the ministry. But which, by the way, is probably what I would say. This is hindering my ability to minister here. So let's get this out. And instead, what happens is, no, the ministry is actually enhanced. As you suffer, your ministry is enhanced. The whole story of Christianity is not just about the removal of suffering, because the center of Christianity is a cross and a resurrection. It's suffering and it addressed. So what should I expect in my experience? Suffering, but it's addressed. Maybe we need to set our expectations on the things that Jesus was saying to set our expectations on. Grieve, but don't grieve as if you have no hope. Suffer, but suffer like Jesus did, and so forth.
Last question for tonight.
Okay.
Is predestination evil? To think that God created us to not worship him and not make our own choices?
Yeah, I think there's an assumption there that God didn't create us with significant freedom. I think God did. The predestination question is different, I think, than what's being represented in the question. If you think about it, even St. Augustine says that there is a difference in us before the fall and after the fall. Before the fall, when you think of Adam and Eve, and you need to be very careful with how you talk about, sin nature. I tend to avoid that language. It's not our very nature to sin. We sin. When you talk about your nature, it means, what does it mean to be a human and not a dog? It means that we have certain properties that dogs don't. Dogs have different properties than we do. But you can be a human without sin. Let me prove it. You have Adam in the garden, human, yet without sin in creation. You have Jesus, be very careful, human, yet without sin. And then we have this doctrine of glorification, the idea of humans in the presence of God, human without sin. That being said, we sin, right? So I'm not committed at all to the idea that God did not create us significantly free. I believe God did create us significantly free. It's completely different to say that God destined you to this choice in the sense of caused Adam or caused me, for example, to choose the sin that I choose. I don't think that's what's happening at all. I don't think that's even necessarily what we even mean by predestination. Instead, when you think of predestination, it's usually it's corporate in a sense, but there's also this idea of predestination, predestined toward a certain end. For those that choose, there's a certain destiny there, and it was set from before the foundation of the earth. This is why, if you look in the Gospels, for those that accept Christ, the wrath of God doesn't abide on them, but for those that reject him, the wrath of God does. This is the essence of John chapter 6, right? There are two destinies there. One is with him, one is without him. Right? So that's a sense, and from before the foundation of the earth, there are certain things that God has predestined. That is completely different than saying he's up there causing you to choose the things that in fact you're choosing. So I just want to pull those things apart and keep it clear there. Does that help a little bit?
I guess.
Oh, stop.
Very
Stop
helpful.
it.
Yes, thank you. Thank you
Okay.
so much. All right, well, we're going to go from the topic of evil to hell. That's a
Which, by the
pick-me-up.
way, one of the things that I pointed out tonight is when there is an act of divine judgment, there might be suffering, but that doesn't mean that it's evil. This point's going to come back up again next week. So,
Teaser there.
there you go.